Hi, my name is Brigid Mark, and thanks so much for tuning in to my presentation about climate organizing during COVID and the racial justice uprisings. So during the public health crisis of COVID-19 and the recent racial justice uprisings, countless organizations in the climate movement have had to alter their priorities, their messaging, and the logistics of how they work. Climate change will only bring on more health crises and other crises, making it imperative to learn how to continue this work while simultaneously experiencing a crisis. Drawing upon analysis of 10 in-depth interviews with a diversity of climate organizers, I investigate the following 3 questions. First, what messages are being constructed about COVID, racial justice uprisings, and climate crisis? Second, what are the advantages and disadvantages to organizing during COVID, and how have folks overcome these disadvantages? And third, what are best practices for climate organizing during these crises? So climate justice organizations and mainstream climate organizations are in the process of negotiating the meaning of COVID-19 and racial justice uprisings. I categorize the understandings arising from this negotiation as profits over people, or people over profits, and health and safety. The people over profits messaging is often adversarial, framing big oil and fossil fuel corporations as the villains and everyday people and the earth as their victims. With COVID-19, people over profits begins to emphasize how exposure to air pollution increases communities' risk of mortality from COVID-19. Corporations are also painted as nefarious groups using this time of hardship to further their selfish interests, a framing that is aimed to install outrage. However, this outrage only works when actions that harm the environment also align with actions which amplify COVID. For example, as Christopher explains, it is difficult to keep pressure on a governor who keeps buckling to fossil fuel interests if the governor has handled COVID relatively well. The health and safety messaging follows the classic environmental justice definition of the environment as where folks live, work, and play. Solutions for climate resilience are the same solutions that would rebuild resilience against pandemics and against racial justice. Protecting workers' rights, healthcare, being safe from racial violence and police brutality, and mitigating pollution are all packaged together as part of the environment within this messaging. Interviewees also mentioned the military's active role in suppressing environmental activism. In Minnesota, Enbridge, a Canadian energy company bent on building tar sands pipelines, indirectly funds law enforcement to police water protectors, who are those resisting the pipeline. Many of the tactics that are now being deployed against racial justice uprisings were actually developed at Standing Rock. So while this messaging appears relatively strong, it is not without caveats. It might not always be the time or the place to be making the connection between climate and COVID or racial justice, as it may come off as tone deaf or drawing attention away from more immediately important issues. 2 of the interviewees, who are people of color, suggested that the climate movement still has a lot of work to do to substantiate this kind of messaging with action. Perhaps an explanation for this disconnect is that climate justice work often attempts to fit social justice inside of climate work, rather than beginning with the social justice framework and including climate. In summary, most of my interviewees argued that extending the frame of climate justice might be necessary for maintaining relevance and organizational survival during crises. Future research should consider the success and survival of these messages post-COVID-19. In each of the interviews, I asked the question of what messages climate organizations should avoid in this time. The prominent disagreement was around what interviewees called ecofascism, a term that can be traced to the Nazi movement, which highlights a link between environmental purity and racial purity. This messaging centers around observations of cleaner air, cleaner water, and wildlife returning. Lee, a leader of a bipartisan climate organization, expressed excitement, saying, "Look at what's changed with COVID, man oh man." And it's really kind of encouraging. The atmosphere is cleaner, the stars are clear, it's fabulous. The other interviewees who criticized this kind of messaging as eco-fascist were sympathetic to those who were excited about seeing changes in ecosystem health, acknowledging that after seeing so much destruction, people are really looking for much needed hope. However, many interviewees sharply rebuked this kind of thinking since it privileges environmental rejuvenation at the expense of death and human suffering. Of my interviewees, the two who championed the so-called eco-fascist approach were older, white, male, and members of conservative, non-climate justice organizations, while the three who critiqued this message were Black young youth and two white women in their 30s who were all part of climate justice organizations. So this trend may mirror a larger divide between climate justice and mainstream organizing. Well, most interviewees noted that moving online had extended the geographic reach of their organization, the number of disadvantages identified far outweighed the advantages. Tactics became less powerful since the media and other targets respond more to physical presence than what Christopher calls a distributed online shadow presence. Online organizing also proves a huge challenge to relationship building and communication. Interviewees found it difficult to have intimate conversations and they missed human interaction. So in order to organize during crises, organizations must promote self-care, find creative ways to continue relationship building and momentum, learn to place their work on the back burner, and directly respond to pressing needs of communities. Next, I outlined some examples of these practices. One best practice that came through in almost all of the interviews was to organize in a way that promotes self-care. Interviewees really appreciated feeling supported to step away from work, allowing the space to process and maintain their mental health. During racial justice uprisings, Janice, as a Black woman, felt that her organization heard her and held her, supporting her decision to step away from work. Extinction Rebellion sometimes spends half of their meetings talking about how everyone is feeling. This kind of culture of care pushes back on the expectations of capitalist productivity, prefigures a future of a less toxic work culture, and allows folks space during crises. From virtual lobbying to lawn chair socials, climate organizers have creatively forged new ways of relationship building, organizing to continue momentum and direct support for those on the front lines. Several interviewees found creative ways to build relationships over Zoom, such as sending folks into breakout rooms, messaging to check in through private chats, and allowing informal time before and after meetings for chatting. Some of the most impressive expressions of creativity included events which aimed to continue momentum. Extinction Rebellion launched a blog where people send in letters, poems, and art pieces related to climate activism. The Relay for Our Water passed a pint of Mississippi water through 200 organizations going over 500 miles. Copal, a Latinx empowerment organization, hosted Coffee and Zoom on climate migration, and a physical tour of frontline communities across California moved successfully online. Finally, Earth Day Live, hosted by a coalition of environmental organizers and organized by youth, brought hundreds of thousands of viewers. Many organizers found it important to place some of their work on the back burner, sidelining their goals. You must meet folks where they're at, as Christopher puts it, and right now where they're at is dealing with immediate survival needs related to COVID and racial justice. Much more time is spent listening, and the confidence to step back is essential to organizing during crises. There was a stark contrast between climate justice organizations and more conservative organizations' proclivity to step back and support frontline communities. My colleague Julia Abel analyzed emails sent by Min 350, a climate justice organization, and Citizens Climate Lobby, a bipartisan organization, during the height of the racial justice uprisings. Min 350 called for donations to BIPOC-led organizations, while CCL continued calling for donations to their own organization. CCL displayed a more neutral messaging related to climate justice since they're bipartisan. For example, on June 17th, also known as Juneteenth, Min 350 put out messaging that said, we have a clear directive in this moment: defund the police and invest in community solutions. They also put out calls to participate in Juneteenth events. CCL, however, made no reference to Juneteenth in their June 17th email, but did mention that an environmental justice group would be relaunching. A few organizations oriented their work to directly respond to COVID or the racial justice uprisings. At the inception of the pandemic, the Green New Deal team at Minnesota 350 made calls to community members asking what they and their community needed. They spent only about one sentence articulating the connection between community solutions and climate solutions, and mostly spent the time listening. The Sierra Club fundraised for immigrant families at the inception of the pandemic and provided frontline support grant money. Fresh Energy had conversations with communities devastated by COVID and racial justice uprisings about rebuilding with energy efficient buildings. This follows in the tradition of past social movements which transition their networks to respond to more immediate crises. So I'd like to end this presentation with a description of the themes that arose from interviewees' description of the future they're organizing to create. Imagination is a really powerful tool during crises. So their vision included healing, reparations for Black and Indigenous peoples, mourning those who have unfairly lost their lives during COVID, providing healthcare for everyone, and everyone having what they need to be whole. It included clean jobs, rejecting capitalism's standards of productivity, and dignified pay. All these solutions must be led by BIPOC. Everyone has access to healthy foods, affordable energy, and public transit. And there are a lot of trees and gardens in this vision and no borders. All spaces are safe and healthy for everyone. Thanks so much for listening.